All right, everybody, it's time to get this show started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Lunchtime Discovery Series presentation brought to you by the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences and the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education. So glad that you could be here today with me for our program. For today's show, we've got a very special guest, and I think you're going to like it. I think you're going to learn something new. You're definitely going to get a perspective on today's topic, environmental justice, that I think is important, and that as institutions, even the museum and I believe also the Office of Environmental Education, things that we're thinking about and things that we think are important as well. Today's guest is a doctoral candidate in agricultural and extension education at North Carolina State University, Tatiana Height. Tatiana, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I just want to give a preemptive apology for the ambient noise that you'll hear in the background. As you can see, I'm not in my home office today, so I do apologize for that. But I'm very excited to give this talk on environmental injustice and how parks and green space are a form of environmental injustice. And I just want to thank you all for having me today. So
we're
the
glad
agenda,
that you could be here.
thank you. So the agenda for today is I'm going to just kind of go through a more deep background and bio on who I am, what sort of research that I have done and currently do, what sort of work that I have done and currently do, then kind of setting some of the context for the issues, and then provide some case studies based on the work that I've done in my history. So I would say that the work that I do is community development. Even though there is a large environmental component and environmental justice piece, to me, it really fits into community development and revitalization, in particular for marginalized communities. Although I haven't only worked in marginalized communities, that's really what I'm passionate about. I'm from Chicago. I've been in North Carolina for 2 years and 8 months now. And I've done a lot of different work that is related to environmental justice, and I've been engaged in the environmental justice movement for about 7 years. And through that time, I've gotten some experience as an environmental educator and also as a city planner. My bachelor's is in natural resources from the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, and then my master's is also in community regional planning from the same school. And then, like you said, I'm working on my doctorate at North Carolina State now. So I'm all into the studies. So I've done work on Black community development. So like what makes communities prosperous, and really that even has an environmental justice focus, just because a lot of these communities, whether prosperous or not, are dealing with environmental justice issues, and even high income or low income folks tend to be in the same communities when they come from Black neighborhoods. Are typically those income bracket folks are living in the same areas. I've done a lot with environmental justice, not just with parks and green space, but with other issues, in particular how environmental justice can be approached from a city planning perspective, some sustainable community development work, and how can we redevelop communities that are needing revitalization with kind of sustainable and green practices, multicultural environmental education. So working with marginalized populations and doing environmental education that is specifically tailored to those populations, which is what my dissertation is really focusing on, is working with those populations and designing programs. It's not just about recruitment and representation, but really about how the program is designed pedagogically, that it is meeting the needs of diverse audiences. And then how do we engage communities, and in particular, for me, my marginalized communities. So the work that you'll see in these case studies that I'm providing is rooted in a lot of the experiences that I've had throughout my career. So some of this will be from my lens as a teacher naturalist. Some of it will be through my lens as someone who's done programming for youth. I've been a water management planner for the state of Nebraska, a community development planner in Kinston, North Carolina, which you'll see some of that work in terms of parks, inequity. And then I've done stormwater work and economic work, and you'll see some of that as well in this presentation. So I think it's important to give some context about what do I mean when I say environmental justice and what do I mean when I say environmental injustice. So for me, environmental injustice is about the inequitable distribution of hazard sites in low-income and minority communities, as well as the inequitable distribution, size and quality of green space in low-income minority communities. Traditionally, and I alluded to this in the description. Traditionally, environmental justice in its roots coming out of Warren County, North Carolina, has been about contamination, and that is still a problem today that is going on. But there have been a number of what I call spinoffs. So the environmental justice movement has branched into other areas such as the energy justice movement, the climate justice movement, parks and green space inequity. So there's a lot of other kind of adjacent issues now. Food justice issues are kind of falling into the environmental justice, land rights, all of these things. There's while it was kind of coined with this environmental racism term as a result of hazard sites and things like that, there's a lot of other issues with land being taken and things like that. And so really the root is this inequitable division of political power over land use decisions in low income and minority communities. So when I say environmental injustice, I'm really talking about those issues. Whereas when I say environmental justice, I'm talking about the activist movement that has responded to those injustices and inequities. So in terms of parks and green space, there are some particular issues that are relevant to parks and green space that I think are environmental justice concerns. So firstly, in low income and minority communities, the quality of parks tends to not be as good, as well as green spaces such as community gardens or just open areas. So there's in urban areas in particular, you tend to find issues such as litter in these low-income minority communities in the parks and green space. So there's, broken bottles, rats and things like that that make it so that while there might be green space available, it's not really accessible to be used. And so that really makes it so that there's an issue for the people in the community. And then there's this issue of outdated or minimal infrastructure. So you tend to find that parks and green space in low-income minority communities don't get updated as often. So one of the communities I'm going to talk about later had gone decades and there hadn't been any additional resources poured into the parks in that community in order to bring them up to the same quality of the more affluent neighborhoods. So that tends to be an issue. It's either outdated or they haven't even put the infrastructure in the first place. Things like having adequate lighting for people to be able to walk, things like making sure that courts and things like that make it so that people can actually engage in those spaces. And there's a lot of, unfortunately, stereotypes about who likes to engage in the outdoors, who is the outdoors for. But when you have issues like not providing the adequate amenities in parks, then it kind of perpetuates that by making it so that it's a space that's really not welcoming or accommodating or really usable. But then it perpetuates this myth of, oh, that group doesn't really like to engage in the outdoors, and who is the outdoors for, and who is the environment for, and who really likes to use parks and that kind of thing. Then minimal square footage, parks and green spaces and environmental justice communities that are low income and minority tend to have smaller spaces. In particular, that is an issue not only in low income communities, but also in urban areas. So you tend to might have a city parcel the size of where a house might be, when parks and other communities would be a lot bigger, and especially per person. So the amount of space that is available per the amount of people in the neighborhood tends to not be as good. And then people then have to travel longer distances as well to get to parks in their community. So if you have to walk an excessively long distance in order to get to the nearest park, then that's a problem. And it's also feeding back into that access issue that I spoke about earlier in terms of the infrastructure. So kind of why is this important? So I talked kind of a bit about the problems that arise with the parks, but what also are the people in these communities missing out on by not having these parks and not having this adequate infrastructure? So firstly, there are a lot of benefits for people and for the community that come from parks and green space. So when we don't have those things in low income and minority communities, then they're also missing out on these other benefits that are adjacent to the parks and the green space that they would otherwise have if those amenities were there and if those amenities were adequate. So for one thing, green space has been shown to reduce stress and improve mental health. So the more time that people are spending outside, the more time that they're engaging in these spaces, they tend to have less stress. So then we know hypertension is an issue with a lot of communities of color, in particular Black folks are dealing with those issues, mental health issues. And so even as we've been going through the COVID-19 pandemic, there's been some pushes of people to, get outside and engage in the outdoors and do these things because it helps with your mental health. And as we're having to stay in our homes and not go out as much and not have access to the normal lifestyle that we usually would, it would be nice to be able to have that outdoor engagement because it also gives you these other benefits in terms of your health. Also, there has been some research that shows that communities that are, I'm so sorry about this ambient noise. And it's not really ambient at this point, but that communities that are dealing with low poverty tend to have more environmental amenities such as bike paths and trails. And so communities that are low income don't have that same access. Communities that are more affluent have more of that. There's research to show that spending time in outdoor recreation and in green spaces reduces symptoms of chronic illnesses, reduces symptoms of ADHD, Alzheimer's, dementia. I mentioned stress, depression, and these are issues that have been prominent in marginalized communities. So to already have those issues and then have that be compounded by not having access to the same amenities to offset those issues is a huge inequity and a huge problem. And then lastly, there are the economic benefits. So parks and green spaces tend to increase the property values of adjacent properties. So to not have those in the community can be detrimental to the property values. And we know that property values are related to taxes, that is then related to schools. So there's a lot of then other issues that get connected to that when these low income, when these marginalized communities don't have access to the same things. And then also when you don't have as much property values, and so you don't have as big of a tax base, that gives city councils or county commissioners an excuse to say, we don't have the tax base coming from this community in order to then reinvest the money to make these parks better. This other community has a better tax base, and so that's why we're funneling money into that neighborhood, is because that's where that neighborhood has the tax base and this one doesn't. And I've seen that in my professional life, saying that the reason we're not investing in this community is because of this, but you have to recognize the inequity of that. And the whole point is trying to even the playing field by addressing these issues instead of allowing one community to continue to be more so advantaged than others. So some of the communities that I've worked in and how I've seen these things kind of play out. Firstly, I'm going to talk about Greensboro, North Carolina. I worked in a community called Cottage Grove. Cottage Grove is over 80% Black, but there's also sizable Latinx and Asian American populations in the community. So it's largely community of color. And the community was founded as a historically Black community, was founded adjacent to a landfill. And this is a pre-regulatory landfill. So now landfills have coverings around them so that when they're underground, there's some protection of seepage that comes out of them. But this one did not. This was pre those regulations. So it was founded next to this landfill, and that has led to soil and water contamination issues, and that has seeped into the park. So there are two primary parks in this Cottage Grove neighborhood. One is the Apache Street Park, and other is Bingham Park. And there are news articles from recent years where Bingham Park became inaccessible. They were saying, don't go into this park because of the contamination issues. And so the community then was losing all those amenities that I spoke about earlier and all of that access that I spoke about earlier and the important benefits of that. But I've also spoken to some people doing interviews with longtime residents, and some folks didn't even get that information that the park was contaminated. So there were people who were still playing, there were youth who were still playing in this park that was a public health concern because they didn't even get the information that the park was unsafe. So on the one hand, you would be losing this access for the people who got that information. But then on the other hand, for the people who don't, they have a health issue now from continuing to engage in that park. And then the other one, the Apache Street Park, and there's a stream that runs through both. So there's been some water quality concerns with the streams that go through both of these parks and go through the rest of the neighborhood as well. The Apache Street Park hadn't been invested in a long time, and the community had to go through the participatory budgeting process and advocate for themselves just to get the infrastructure to update that park. Once it got updated, now people have been starting to engage. Youth have been playing out there more, but those dollars weren't just automatically spent. They had been getting promised and promised over again. We're going to do these updates. We're going to do these updates, and just hadn't been doing them. And the citizens ended up having to really, press on them just to get what they should have gotten without having to ask. So one of the things that we did in order to address this is do a stream cleanup in the stream that goes through the neighborhood, as well as those two parks. So we had some volunteers come out last month, and we were able to pick up, we had 25 bags of litter. We had, you can see in this third photo, a shopping cart. There was some wiring from a bed frame that was out there, tires, clothes, all sorts of stuff that should not be in the waterways that we pulled out just from that one stream cleanup just for a couple of hours. But unfortunately, there are just concerns about, with that seepage from the landfill, how much that's going to continue to happen and continue to happen. And people in the community, neighbors in the community, have also expressed concern over, why are we even the ones who have to put ourselves in this position to even do these cleanups? Why is the city not doing that on their own? Why are the residents being asked to go out and do this instead of it just getting cleaned up on a regular basis? And what sort of exposure is that prompting for us by having to go out and do this in this area that we have some real concerns about being contaminated? They've already found contamination in the soil, and so we have some real concerns about the water contamination as well. So these are more pictures from the work days that we had, and there has been some funding to be able to support continuing to do these work days quarterly, hopefully, and hope that will contribute to getting just some more data and information about what exactly is going on in terms of the contamination in this community, so that can hopefully be used as a springboard to get some additional action and some additional resources into this community in order to address these environmental injustice issues. Another story that I've told before is of someone who this community has a sizable immigrant population, and there was someone who was kind of trying to use water from the stream as an irrigation source to do their own little gardening, which is something we would love to encourage. But unfortunately, because of the contamination in the water that was going through, and they were doing this right, the water that went through the park, they weren't able to do that, and they were like, that's not safe. You can't do that. So just think about that. You should be able to have clean access to natural resources and not have to be cut off because of concerns about public health and safety. So then the second one, I mentioned before that I've worked in Kinston, North Carolina. So Kinston is in Lenoir County, which is a tier 1 county. So one of the more economically distressed counties in the state, with a population of about 20,000, and has been experiencing some population decline. There are flood issues and disaster impacts. I talked about the climate justice. I mentioned climate justice earlier, so there are some of those concerns going on, just about people who are already low income, already marginalized, being more impacted by natural disasters and having a harder recovery time. So those are the kinds of things that Kinston is already dealing with. Kinston is dealing with hard times in terms of government and citizen relations, some mistrust that's been going on in the community, some racial tensions that have been going on in the community. There's a big Black-white divide. And then there are 6 major parks operated by the Parks and Recreation Department that are in the city. So Kinston is a majority Black community. Although in terms of leadership, that hasn't always been reflective. The city did elect their first all-Black council a couple of years back, but in terms of leadership positions, in terms of staff, that's not always reflective of the overall population. And so of the parks I've listed here, the size of the parks, one of them is the biggest one, the Newsway Park is 55 acres. And then I want to call attention to this Holloway Park that's 3.49 acres. And the reason that I want to call attention to Holloway Park, the second smallest park in Kinston, is because Holloway is situated in East Kinston, which East Kinston is the most low income part of the city. It is where a lot of that concentration of the Black population is situated, is in East Kinston. And that's, again, where one of the smaller parks of all the parks in the city is in that neighborhood. So on this map, in the orange, I made this on GIS. The orange shows all of the parks. And this one here, if you can see where I'm hovering with my mouse, is Holloway. So it's almost difficult to even see. And then it's not the smallest one though. There is a smaller park, but that's a downtown park, and so that's why that one is, because it's more just in an urban area. So these are kind of some of the issues that they're dealing with in that community. So some of the work that I've done with that is to try to just work with communities on how can we advocate for increasing the park access in East Kinston. There was a lot of concern because there had been a lot of investment happening in terms of parks in the city, but a lot of that investment was happening in areas that some people felt like was inequitable. They were feeling like, a lot of this is going to these neighborhoods that don't have most of the Black population. They're going to these neighborhoods that aren't dealing with these income issues, median income of $11,000. And so all of these resources are being funneled over there, and this other neighborhood in the city is not getting attention. So we had a series of community meetings, and people were very, very clear about the fact that they wanted to see more dollars get invested into Holloway. It was very important to them. They talked about education. They talked about the benefits. They talked about wanting to have safe places for the children to play. They talked about issues of crime and feeling like if there were more outlets for the youth, then the crime could possibly go down. And we did have some data from the police department to support that notion in terms of comparing the parks in other neighborhoods and what their experiences were in terms of crime, and then the crime rates in this community in comparison to the amount of parks and green space and adequate parks and green spaces at that in the neighborhood. So this is a picture of Holloway. There is a recreation center that is situated at Holloway, and we were able to secure a grant of $750,000 in response to the community's concerns. But this is an issue that people are talking about and saying that we want something to be done about this. And these are people who don't have the same background as me and a city planner who I can say, oh, I can cite the source that tells you that this is a good community revitalization. What does this do for education? What does this do for crime? But they already know that. They have these perceptions just from their experience. They don't need that education and background. They don't need to have been working in parks, because they're like, I'm experiencing this on a daily basis. And I can tell you, I bet if you do this, this will be an outcome for our community, and this is what we want. And so I felt like my role was just to say, all right, I'm going to listen to what you want, and we're going to try to make that come to life. So people were saying that they wanted more lighting. People were saying that they wanted better courts for the kids to play on and things like that. And we tried to address those concerns. So then another case study is in Lincoln, Nebraska. I mentioned earlier that I went and did my bachelor's and my master's in Nebraska. Which Nebraska is a largely white state, but there is a neighborhood in Lincoln that had more Latinx folks than other areas, and had more immigrant and refugee populations in other areas, and also had a lower income than other areas in the city, which the city overall is doing pretty well in terms of employment, in terms of median income, housing and health opportunities and things like that. But when you disaggregate it and look down into some of these smaller neighborhoods, such as the one that I'm going to talk about here, some inequities started to become apparent. So I was particularly looking at one census tract, and this was in partnership with an organization called NeighborWorks Lincoln. I was particularly looking at one census tract, which was situated in the northwest quadrant of the city. The northwest quadrant has the highest poverty rate in Lincoln, and the highest percentage of minorities in the whole city, racial minorities, as well as the second lowest amount of acres of park space per person in the city. So I did an analysis where I pulled the different quadrants of the city, and you can see where the minority concentrations are situated just based on these 4 quadrants. And just in general, people kind of know that South Lincoln is kind of the more affluent part of the city. So this is the northern part of Lincoln here, and then the southern part here. So I used that to break down into 4 quadrants and do a comparison to look at what was going on with the parks and green spaces that were available in the city. So I went in GIS and did a buffer zones to see how much park space was available within a quarter mile and then within a half a mile. A quarter mile is about a 5-minute walk, and a half a mile is about a 10-minute walk. And so you can see here on the left side that within a quarter mile, there's fewer housing units that are within a quarter mile. There's more that are within a half a mile, but even some then are missing. So South Salt Creek is the neighborhood in that northwest quadrant. And so the city of Lincoln had a goal in the environmental plan that all households should be within a half mile, that 10-minute walk of a park. So there was really only one park in this neighborhood. There was a couple of community gardens that really weren't publicly accessible to everyone. So they were kind of accessible to certain households or through certain church groups or organizations, but weren't accessible to everyone. And then there was one major park which hadn't been invested in a long time, called Cooper Park. Cooper Park had gone over 20 years without getting adequate investment, and then residents in the neighborhood started to complain, and finally were able to get some investment. But again, like I said earlier, these are things that are happening on their own in the more affluent communities, that then in these communities they're having to make a ruckus just to get the same treatment that these more affluent communities are getting. So when I ran the analysis, I found that only 55% of the units in this northwest quadrant were within a half a mile of a park, which was the Cooper Park, primarily. And whereas in these more affluent quadrants, they were already at 100% or almost 100% of the goal that Lincoln had set forth in the environmental plan. So then I looked at what's going on with the quarter mile. So while Lincoln is focusing on a half mile buffer, nationally, the standard is that everyone should be within a quarter mile of a park or an adequate green space. And so when I ran it with that higher level of scrutiny, I found that even fewer were able to have that access to a park. So only 35% compared to 55% before. And so while this is then the second lowest, this 17% here is the second most in terms of minority distribution, and has the lowest then number of housing units within a quarter mile buffer. And then lastly, I am going to talk about Bertie County, because I do want to give a positive. So yes, I don't want to make it sound like, totally negative, although this is a very serious issue and I think that it deserves a lot of attention. I do want to also highlight a community that I've been working with who is taking active measures to address parks and green space in their community in a way that I think is really impressive. And so Bertie County is 61% Black. They have been experiencing a population decline. So they have an 11% population decline over the last 10 years, a 25% poverty rate. And I already talked earlier about how poverty rate tends to be linked to your access to certain environmental amenities and parks and green spaces and that kind of thing. But Bertie County acquired a 147-acre property, and they are developing it as an outdoor recreation site. And it's called Tall Glass of Water. So working with different people to develop this site. They had a Birdie Beach Day last year, and over 900 people came to the Birdie Beach Day. And they're actively working to get some program plans developed. They have a 5-phase project to kind of get the park developed, and have been getting a lot of community engagement and really trying to listen to what the public wants to see in terms of the development of this site. And they're really trying to have this be an anchor site for more community revitalization in the community and hopefully some economic development. There's evidence that in other places, adding parks, adding green space has led to also jobs being created. So there is some evidence to support this is a good project, not only for the health of the community, not only for the tax base, but also in raw numbers of jobs. So very impressive projects coming out of there. The press release was just published last month. So I think just for people who are interested in hearing more about parks and equity, I think this is a good project to just follow and see what's going on with them. One of the goals that they've set forth is that they want to see just in Bertie's parks master plan, they want to see more focus on social justice and equity, just in terms of how their parks are operating and what they're doing in their park management in general, not just with the Tall Glass of Water project. So I just want to throw a shout out to there, because I know it's been kind of a lot of, oh, these are the issues, but I also want to say that there are folks who are actively working on these issues that should be focused on. And there's some others that if I'm ever invited to talk back, I'm going to be working on some other projects, and I hope that I'll get to share them. But it's too soon now. It's too soon now to talk about that. But I do want to say that there'll be others, and people can contact me directly if they want to hear more about that. But for now, I'll open it up to questions.
Tatiana, thank you very much. That was
problem.
a fantastic presentation. Excellent job.
Thank you.
And I guess the first thing should be said is thank you for doing this work. Like, thanks for being out there.
I do it because I think it's fun.
Well, right. I mean, getting to work in communities, do community work, but also work in these places where people are going to spend time outdoors.
Yeah.
Like
yeah,
people
I
looking
think,
for fresh air. That's so critical and crucial.
Yeah, I think just engaging with is like it's definitely important work, but I feel like I don't feel like I don't need to be thanked, because I'm getting some benefit in just that I enjoy doing it. I enjoy engaging with the people, and I enjoy helping people to realize their vision of what they would like to see for their community. I don't come in with my own ideas about what things. I'm like, I know this is a problem, so if you recognize it's a problem and you would like support in handling this in whatever way is most interested to the community, then yeah. But I think it's important work, and I just enjoy helping see people's communities turn into what they would like their communities to look like.
I'll remind everybody, drop your questions and thoughts into the chat box there on YouTube. I'm going to be grabbing your thoughts and questions from there and posing them to Tatiana in just a second. But as you were speaking, I got curious about elected officials in some of these places. And I can kind of guess what the current makeup of these city councils or Parks and Rec department, planning boards, city planning departments, that sort of thing look like. But as you look across, and since you've worked in lots of different places, do you see that better diversity and representation in these governing positions reflect more investment in low income or community of color places?
Man, I think it depends on the community. I've seen it both ways. Unfortunately, in one experience that I had, I think that um, there hadn't been a strong history of representation. And so a lot
Mm-hmm.
of times in those situations, when people then do get into those roles, there is some hesitation about rocking the boat too much and about shaking things up too much because they want to be able to hold on to those positions and have some concern that if I do too
Sure.
much and make too many waves, that I might even lose my foothold in this position at all. And so unfortunately, I've seen that play out where, they may have internally supported doing things like that, but wanted to slow walk those kinds of things just because um, of fear of what that, how that might shape the future. But
Mm-hmm.
in other cases, I do think I've seen, more positive outcomes when having that representation because you get more voices. And sometimes I've seen people who are really passionate that were just a resident who decided I'm gonna try to run for office or take on a position of power, and then their just personal passion shone through. And then it was just like, wow, you're making all of these boss moves just because before you were on the opposite side of it. And so now you're channeling that energy into when you have power. And so I think it can be both ways. And I would like to see more of the latter.
Yeah, absolutely. So many times it seems like in efforts like this and across all sorts of environmental issues, right? It takes champions uh, doing the work. Especially, I'm guessing, and based on what you're saying here, that you need those champions to sort of get over the entrenched racism and disparity that's been going on for decades and decades. Okay, I'm gonna go. Okay, the chat blew up in the time that I was asking my questions, so I'm gonna see what these folks want to know. First up, from Steph Jeffries at NC State Dendrology. Hi. In Raleigh, we are seeing gentrification as parks and green space amenities are added. How do we improve communities without pushing out longtime residents through gentrification?
That's a great question. And so there are some great resources. One of my colleagues, so I'm a member of the Planning and the Black Community Division of the American Planning Association. And one of my colleagues, Carlton Ely, has put out a lot of content on equitable redevelopment and how to do redevelopment work without pushing out folks. And so I would say to that just look into those resources because there's a lot of resources from people who've been doing it for a long time who have strategies on that. But I think one of the things is that we need to be strategic about the kinds of development that we're accepting and who we're giving these sort of jobs to. Um, because in certain cases you can work with whoever you're bringing in to do the project and work with them in such a way that they're retaining the value of the community. So if you're doing this redevelopment work, making sure to employ people who live in the community and things like that on the project, to have restrictive covenants and things like that, to where you are retaining. There's ways to do districts and districting to say that we're going to retain this essence of the community or something, or we're going to try to make sure that we retain a certain percentage of the original population, or we're going to make sure that we keep prices, like a pricing cap in terms of rent and things like that. So there's a lot of times we can do these agreements preemptively with the folks who are in charge, such as the city council or the county commissioners or whoever, to make sure that you have it in writing that if you do this project, these are the protections that we have in place to make sure that the community actually ends up reaping the benefit and not outside folks.
Excellent. Stacy wants to know if the national standard, the quarter mile distance to a park or green space, applies to all areas or only municipalities and urban areas.
So I should say this: that standard isn't regulated in any way. It's a recommendation of this is the quality that people should be experiencing in their community. So it's not like when I say national, I certainly don't mean federal in any way where it's like in every community this is what you're required to do. It's just that folks who do work on parks and green space and health impacts are saying that the gold standard is to have in all places urban, rural access within a half mile. And in some cases, it doesn't even, because rural areas tend to be less developed and some, or I shouldn't say less urbanized. It ends up working out in that favor because it's not just parks, it's also green space. Mm-hmm. And so there tends to be a lot more of that in less urban areas anyway, but it is just a gold standard, not a requirement.
There you go, Stacy. Let's see. Cal Hip, how do we scale these community projects and or disseminate lessons learned broadly? This, we get experts to talk about it on the internet.
Expert, that's very kind. I would love to someday live up to that word. Can you tell me the question one more time?
Yeah, how do we scale these projects and or disseminate these lessons learned broadly?
Yeah, I think in terms of there's a lot of things. So when I hear scale, I think what they're trying to ask about is doing more of these projects and maybe larger projects. And so I think that is perhaps a funding concern. Some folks just don't have the money. We had acres and acres of property in Kinston, and I wanted so badly to redevelop that into park space because it had been flood buyout land, and you can't put buildings in those areas. You can't have impervious surfaces and things like that. So it was just prime real estate for a park project, and it would be right in East Kinston where there was this need for parks and green space and where people were expressing that that's what they were interested in. But there was a lot of funding barriers. We didn't have the capital to do that on our own, and so we would have to seek outside funding. And just with all of the overgrowth, it would probably be just $1 million to even clear that area out. There had been a lot of illegal dumping going on in there that would all have to be cleaned up. It would have to be fenced off to stop that. A massive campaign to educate people and get people to really stop doing all this illegal dumping in that area before we could even begin to get into the plans and the funds that were required to get the architectural renderings and things like that to do that, and then to actually carry out the project. So I think funding is a real concern in terms of scale, and that's why a lot of times these communities do go for smaller parcels and do smaller urban gardens and things like that. And that's also why Berkeley County is in such a unique position to have these hundreds of acres. But also in terms of disseminating the information, I think communicating between municipalities and trying to collaborate on efforts. I'm seeing communities right now in Raleigh and Durham communicating with each other and trying to join forces to do work on these issues. And I've been seeing a lot of community calls about just environmental education. I would love to see community calls about parks and green space and what can we do around that. So definitely opening the doors of communication and maybe lowering some of the bureaucracy barriers so that we can work together on these issues and do some more regional projects as well.
The folks from the Office of Environmental Education have a good question, and that's what can environmental educators or environmental education as a field do to help these communities?
Man, that is such a great question. I'm sorry, I'm getting I'm getting so relaxed. I would love to see more conversations take place about equity in environmental education. There is so much literature about how environmental education broadly doesn't focus on these issues. And I think there are cases, there are folks who do that, but broadly, nationally, wide sweeping, we're not there. And I think that needs to be a larger conversation in environmental education spaces. And I think we need to do more than just look at these earthworms and look at these plants, but also let's have a conversation about you as an environmental citizen, and let's have a conversation about you and the action that you can take in your community, so that we're empowering these youth who are coming into these educational spaces to go on and do action in community. We as environmental educators can't be in every community, but we can have a group of 25 students come to us, and we give them the tools to then go, and you might have some 13-year-olds at their city council meeting saying, hey, I want to park in my neighborhood. Also, there's a book that I just used with a group of students. I purchased it only to use it with students, Kamala and Maya's Big Idea. And it is about two young girls. It's a true story. Two young girls who went and said, we want to park in our community. And they went to their landlord and he said, you can do this. And so they went and asked around and got all these adults and other people involved and were able to raise the capital and do the project. So I think we need to be sharing more stories like that in our environmental education spaces and giving youth the tools to become change agents in their communities.
That's beautiful. Let's do it.
Let's
make it happen.
Let's.
All right. This Q&A is going off over here. Let me get some more thrown your way. Okay, Renee's asking if you've worked with any of the Dix Park planning.
No, that's an easy question.
There you go.
I would be open to it, but no.
All right, Jane, let's see. Says, thank you. It's very instructive for Raleigh and communities throughout North Carolina and the U.S. I'm glad to learn about the Tall Glass of Water project in Bertie County. Let's see. Elena, here we go. Is there a toolkit or guidance for community members to explore, gather resources, and mobilize their community to solve issues to nature access?
There was a roundtable, and they actually, I think, do it annually now. So they did one in the 90s to get professionals together who are working in these issues once a year to talk about what are the best practices and what do we need to do and how do we move the needle on this. I don't want to be so cliche, but and so they published their findings from that. And oh man, the name of it is escaping me, but I do have a copy. But yes, the American Planning Association got together with parks professionals and they did put out some guidance on that. Email me and I will send that document or that link to that page. But yeah, they have a convening every year. Maybe not since COVID, but they were having a convening.
They probably went online like everything else.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would say every year there were more than one of them.
All right. Excellent. Okay. Austin wants to know, how do you think, Austin says, I'm curious, how do you think about the affordable housing / environmental justice conversation? I often see affordable housing promoted in lieu of open space and trees.
I really don't. That is a very difficult question. But I don't want to see one chosen over the other. I want to see us do both. I would really, honestly, as much as I'm about parks and green space and as much as I'm about that equity issue, housing is a huge issue as well. And affordable housing is a huge issue as well. And when you're looking at the 3 areas of community revitalization, you've got community development, which parks falls into that. You've got housing, you've got economic development. So you can't say we're gonna just leave green space and not do affordable housing. You have to have both, or that's really not a holistic approach that's going to be effective for the community. Yeah.
Right. If you want to build up a community, you need all of these elements and you have to
Right.
devote the resources to all of these elements instead of picking and choosing what problem you think you're solving, because in the end it wouldn't solve the problem.
And I think, so what is very interesting too about that question, and one of the projects that I mentioned in Kinston, where I've mentioned the redevelopment money that we applied for, they were having a hard time, the community members who came to the meetings were having a hard time saying housing or parks. They were like, ooh, ooh, and the numbers were so close in terms of, so we ended up just dividing the money, to do both of the projects in one. It's just a broader community revitalization project. But you really, yeah, I think from a community perspective, people want to see both. From a revitalization perspective, you have to have both. I think what folks can do when they're doing these affordable housing developments is to make sure to leave a certain percentage on the parcels for parks that are directly available to the citizens who are living there. And that will be a good compromise, but I definitely wouldn't choose one over the other.
All right. Let's see. Uh, how can those of us at a local university most effectively partner for community engagement?
Hmm. That's a good question. And I think people be careful because I've had experiences, and before I went back to get my doctorate, where I'm working in communities and universities really didn't have a good rep uh, like a good rep. I'm having a hard
Mm-hmm.
time thinking of the full word. But they didn't have a good history. They didn't have a good relationship, um, because communities would come in with their own ideas and kind of push their own ideas instead of what the community wanted, or they would just come with a plan and not with actual resources. So I think for one thing, don't come in with your own ideas. If you want to support the community and you want to engage with the community, try to push forward the community's ideas. I think if you want to partner, try to come with some resources. And come with some, this is what we're going to actually do, and not just this is what we want to talk to you about doing and not really do. And For the love of all things, don't just come for a few months and then leave forever.
Uh, to that question, and there's a related one here in the chat box too. When you've talked to these communities and about what they want, are there some common threads of what these communities are asking for, like what they want from their cities, what they want in their park spaces and their nature spaces?
That's a good question.
Like if there are city planners watching the program, I don't know if there are or not, but right, if we had people
There
in,
probably are.
city of Raleigh watching the show today, for example, and maybe they haven't quite made those inroads, what would be some common threads that they could say, okay, these are some things to think about and ways to start conversations, maybe?
Yeah, I think things that I've heard, for one thing, is not asking for a lot of labor from the citizens, without some sort of compensation. So in particular, I'm thinking about these cleanup days. People have said, please stop asking us to come and clean up a stream and you're not going to give us anything in return. Um, I think for some folks who are traditionally identified as an environmentalist, it might be a fun thing to do to go clean up this stream. But for other folks who have jobs that they don't necessarily have the same flexibility that other folks have, folks who are dealing with a lot of personal life concerns, to ask me to come in my free time and clean up a stream is a ludicrous request to not give me something in return. And then another thing that I've heard is, what are we giving in return? Some folks are universities like to give out gift cards, and people don't want gift cards. They want something, maybe some actual money. And so I think, yeah, people just don't like being asked to. I had an issue. I saw that in 3 out of the 4 communities that I talked about today. Where they're like, don't ask us to do this thing and you're just basically laboring us. In one of the communities, there were some folks who were like, why would you ask me to come and work this land that was taken from my people or something, like. And so it's just
Mm-hmm.
being mindful of that. I think and giving people positions where they actually have some decision-making power. Something that I've heard is that a lot of times us government officials, or when I was in that capacity, would already come with decisions and just be pretending to ask for feedback and not actually be prepared to make action on that. So people wanted to say, I want to be in the room when these decisions are being made, and don't just pretend like I'm actually a part of the decision, but actually engage me as a part of the decision. We as planners do that a lot. We make people think that they have a choice when they don't. Not me personally, but us as a whole, we make people think that they have a choice when they really don't, or you've already made your decision. And that's the opposite of what we need to be doing as public servants. And people know. So people have said, we want to be actually have some decision making power in this. We don't want you to try to just work us and get a lot out of us. And we want to see actual tangible benefits for the kids. So a lot of I've always heard focus on the youth and making sure that there's a lot of programming available at the youth level.
All right. Excellent stuff. The rest of the comments in the chat, just for your edification, are all about how great this is, how great the presentation was, and how thankful they are for you for being here to chat with us and for being engaged and involved.
Thank you. Yeah, I was hearing people that were like, "Oh, I heard you're going to be speaking." Oh my goodness. Oh man, I'm nervous now. All these people are going to be listening, so I'm glad to hear that that people are getting something out of this conversation. I always just get nervous.
Well, I and everybody else here in the chat thinks you did a wonderful job, and I am grateful to you for being here and sharing your time in your right now very busy day to talk to us about these things.
Thanks.
So thank you very much.
And I should have put a slide with my contact information, but it's just occurring to me now. But I hope Lisa does not mind me saying this, but Lisa, who sent out the information about this, has my contact information. So if anybody wants to reach out to her to get my email, just respond to the post that you saw or whatever to get my email. That is a good idea if you want to talk further about this, or if you want to see some of the write-ups and things about these projects.
I think that's a good solution. Everybody email Lisa. Email the office.
I'm so sorry.
You can email the Office of Environmental Education within the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. They can get in touch with them. You can find me at the Museum of Natural Sciences website, and I'll route you to the right people to make sure that you get information. We have a huge team of people. We'll make sure that everybody gets the information they want. And Tatiana, we'll definitely have you back on the program in the future to share more updates with us.
Thank you.
When you have them. That would be wonderful. Everybody, I'll remind you that you can subscribe to the museum's YouTube channel right here. And if you click the bell to get notified, you'll know when new videos go up, but also when we go live here on YouTube, so that next Wednesday at noon, you don't even have to remember it. You can just get that ping and jump right back here. We'll be here with another Lunchtime Discovery Series lecture every Wednesday at noon, whether they're happening here on the internet virtually, or maybe one day in the future, we'll be back inside the Daily Planet Theater at the Museum of Natural Sciences, and we'll get to enjoy one another's company in person too. You can follow the museum to get updates on our programming. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Natural Sciences for all three. And you can follow the Office of Environmental Education on Twitter, where you can get lots of great updates. They're at North Carolina EE. Also, check out their website because you can sign up for their email newsletter and get updates about every Wednesday's program so you know what's coming up, as well as get information about the ones that are coming up for the next couple of months. So I think that was everything that I needed to say. Once more, Tatiana, thank you so much. Everybody, have a great afternoon. We'll see you again soon.